Cold fingers clamped Jacob Hale's coat sleeve as thunder rolled over the ranch gate. Rainwater poured from Clara Whitmore's hair, soaking his knuckles in the dust. She held tight, boots sliding in mud, breath shaking against his chest. "Sir, I just need work tonight," Clara whispered through chattering teeth. Jacob looked once at the empty house behind him, windows dark. Storm wind pushed the door wider, firelight touching her bruised hands. His jaw hardened like winter fence wire. "I need a wife." The ranch gate chain rattled against the post. Clink. Scrape. Clink. Jacob Hale did not look up at first. The wind pushed rain across the yard, hard and slanting, drumming against the barn roof. Another sharp rattle cut through the storm. Clink. Scrape. Clink. Jacob lifted his eyes from the dull fire in the stove. The chain moved again. Not the wind. A hand. He stepped onto the porch boards. The wood groaned under his boots, old nails shifting in swollen planks. Cold rain slapped his hat brim. Beyond the gate stood a woman. Her dress clung dark and heavy to her frame. Water ran from her hair in thin lines down her face and neck. She gripped the chain with shaking fingers. Clink. Scrape. Clink. The sound carried through the yard like a weak bell no one wanted to answer. Jacob walked down the steps slowly. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The storm pressed against his coat. The woman tried to straighten. Her knees buckled. Her hand caught the gate post, knuckles white. "Sir." Her voice came thin through the rain. She swallowed hard. "I just need work." Jacob stopped a few steps away. He looked at the mud on her boots. The road dust washed down into brown streams around her feet. Her wrists carried dark bruises beneath the rainwater. The chain slipped in her grip. Clink. She caught it again before it fell. "I can cook," she said. "Clean. Tend the animals." The storm cracked overhead. Thunder rolled low across the valley. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Name," he said. "Clara Whitmore." The name hung between them. The wind shoved the gate once more. The chain scraped against iron. Clink. Scrape. Clara's fingers clung harder. "I walked 2 days," she said quietly. "The last wrench turned me away." Rain ran down her cheek. She did not wipe it. Jacob looked past her down the empty road. No wagon. No horse. Just mud stretching into the gray hills. "You got family?" he asked. She shook her head. "You got someone chasing you?" The answer took too long. Her grip tightened on the chain again. Clink. Jacob exhaled slowly through his nose. Behind him the house stood silent. One window glowed faint with stove light. Inside waited a table with one chair pulled out. One plate. Always one. He turned back toward her. "You said you wanted work." "Yes, sir." His voice came flat. "I need a wife more than a worker." Clara blinked at him through the rain. The words did not seem to land at first. Then her shoulders sagged, like something holding her upright had finally broken. Jacob reached for the gate latch. The iron hinge groaned as he pulled it open. She tried to step forward. Her legs failed again. Jacob caught her by the arm before she hit the mud. Her weight leaned against him, light as wet canvas. The chain swung loose behind them. Clink. Clink. Jacob guided her toward the porch. The boards creaked beneath their steps. Warm stove light spilled through the open door. And for the first time in years, Jacob Hale did not walk back inside alone. The door closed behind them with a dull thud. Wind clawed once at the boards. Then the latch settled. Quiet. Jacob eased Claire onto the wooden chair beside the stove. The chair legs scraped across the floor. Her boots left small pools of muddy water beneath them. The stove breathed steady heat into the room. Tick. 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 Metal warming against cold. Clara's shoulders trembled. Not from fear now. From thaw. Jacob hung his coat by the door. Rainwater dripped to the floorboards with slow, steady taps. He crossed the room without hurry. A kettle rested on the stove lid. The lid rattled faintly as the water inside stirred. He poured the hot water into a dented tin cup. Steam curled upward. He set it in Clara's hands. Her fingers hovered above it first. Then they wrapped around the metal. A sharp breath left her. Heat. Jacob watched the steam drift past her face. "You can drink," he said. She nodded. The cup clinked softly against her teeth as she tried to steady her hands. Outside, the storm pushed against the walls again. Rain hammered the roof boards. The house held. Inside, the stove ticked and breathed. Jacob moved to the shelf near the sink. He pulled down a folded wool blanket. The fabric snapped once in the air. He draped it across Clara's shoulders. The wool swallowed the last of the rain running down her dress. She held the blanket tight with one hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob did not answer. He walked to the door again. The latch lifted. Cold air slipped inside for a moment. He stepped onto the porch. The gate chain swayed in the wind. Clink. Scrape. Clink. Jacob stared at it. The sound drifted across the yard like a memory. He stepped into the rain long enough to push the gate closed again. The iron bar dropped into place. Clack. The chain fell still. Jacob returned inside and shut the door. Warmth closed around him again. Clara sat where he left her, cup between both hands. The stove hummed low. Water boiled harder now. He filled a basin from the kettle and set it on the table. Steam rose in thick white ribbons. "Wash," he said. Clara nodded slowly. She dipped the cloth into the hot water. The cloth darkened. She pressed it against her face. A small gasp escaped her throat. Heat against skin that had known only cold for miles. Mud ran down into the basin. The water turned gray. Jacob moved through the room in quiet habit. He set bread on the table. A knife tapped once against the cutting board. Thok. Butter scraped across the crust. Soft. Clara lowered the cloth. Color had begun to creep back into her cheeks. The blanket hung around her shoulders like a shield. She looked at the bread. Her eyes flickered once toward Jacob. "Eat," he said. She did. The first bite came slow. The second faster. The third faster still. Crumbs scattered across the table. The room filled with small sounds. Bread tearing. Knife tapping. Stove ticking. Life. Jacob sat across from her. The chair creaked beneath his weight. Clara slowed when she noticed him watching. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" "For eating like this." Jacob shook his head once. "Food's for eating." Silence settled again. Outside, the storm rolled farther down the valley. Thunder faded to distant murmurs. Rain softened. Drip, drip, drip from the roof edge. Clara wiped her hands on the cloth. Her fingers trembled less now. Jacob noticed the marks again. Bruises circling both wrists. Dark. Old. His eyes held there for a moment. Clara saw where he was looking. Her hand slid beneath the blanket. Hidden. Another small silence fell. Jacob stood. The chair legs dragged across the floor. He moved toward the back of the house. The hallway boards creaked under his boots. A door opened. Another room. Unused. He carried out a dry dress and a pair of wool socks. The fabric rustled in his hands. He set them on the table beside her. "You can change in there." He nodded toward the hallway. Clara stared at the clothes. Her throat moved once. "Those were," she began. "My wife's." The words landed flat. Jacob's face did not move. The stove ticked louder in the quiet. Clara touched the edge of the dress. Soft cloth. Clean. She stood slowly. The chair legs scraped again. Her steps across the floor sounded uncertain. Board. Creak. Board. Creak. She paused near the hallway. Jacob? He looked up. Why did you let me stay? Jacob leaned one hand against the table. The wood groaned beneath his palm. Storm's bad tonight. That's not the only reason. He did not answer right away. The kettle lid rattled again as the water boiled down. Finally he spoke. A house shouldn't sound empty forever. Clara lowered her eyes. She walked down the hallway. The door closed softly behind her. Jacob stood alone in the kitchen again. The house settled around him. Tick, tick, tick. The stove. The rain fading. The quiet breathing of old boards. He cleared the table slowly. Breadcrumbs brushed into his palm. The basin water carried streaks of mud from Clara's journey. He carried it outside. The door creaked open. Cool air brushed his face. The storm had weakened to a soft drizzle. Across the yard the gate stood still. But the chain shifted once in the breeze. Clink. Jacob froze. His eyes moved to the dark road beyond the fence. Nothing. Only wet dirt and empty night. Still. The sound stayed with him. He stepped back inside and shut the door. The latch dropped. Clack. The warmth returned again. Footsteps creaked softly from the hallway. Clara emerged wearing the dry dress. The sleeves hung slightly loose on her arms. But the color had returned to her face. Her wet hair fell across her shoulders in dark strands. She held the blanket tighter. Jacob looked once. Then nodded. You can take the spare room. Clara hesitated. Her eyes moved across the quiet kitchen. The table. The stove. The fire. A home. She nodded once. Thank you, Jacob. Her voice carried more strength now. She turned toward the hallway again. The floorboards creaked beneath lighter steps. The door to the spare room opened. Closed. Jacob sat down in his chair. The house breathed around him. For the first time in years, another presence moved inside those walls. Outside the storm faded into the distant hills. But somewhere far down the road, faint beneath the dripping trees, a horse snorted in the darkness. And Jacob Hale did not hear it. Morning crept slowly over the Hale ranch. Gray light pressed through the kitchen window. The stove had burned low during the night. Ash settled with a faint whisper. Jacob Hale stepped into the kitchen and fed the fire. Wood slid into the iron mouth. Crack. Flame caught. Warmth began its slow return. The room smelled of smoke and old pine. Jacob poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. Metal tapped the iron lid. Tick, tick, tick. Outside the wind had quieted. Only dripping eaves answered the dawn. Drip, drip, drip. Jacob stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots. Cold morning air brushed his face. The yard lay washed clean from the storm. Mud shone dark beneath the pale sky. The ranch gate stood closed. The chain hung still. Clink. A small sound as the breeze shifted. Jacob watched it for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the house. Inside, a door creaked softly down the hallway. Slow footsteps followed. Board. Creak. Board. Creak. Clara Whitmore stepped into the kitchen. The borrowed dress hung neatly on her frame now. Her hair was braided loosely down her back. She paused at the doorway like someone unsure where she belonged. Jacob nodded once toward the stove. Fire's warm. She moved closer. Heat reached her face. A small breath left her lips. Morning, she said. Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The kettle lid rattled faintly behind him. He slid 1 cup across the table. It scraped softly across the wood. Clara wrapped both hands around it. Steam curled past her cheeks. Warmth again. Outside a horse snorted from the corral. A restless sound. Clara flinched. The cup rattled once against the table. Jacob noticed. "Just the gelding," he said. She nodded, though her fingers stayed tight on the cup. Breakfast came simple. Bread. Salt pork. The knife tapped steady against the cutting board. Thok. Thok. The room filled with quiet working sounds. Clara watched the rhythm for a moment. Then she stood. "Where's the broom?" Jacob looked up. "In the pantry." She found it and began sweeping. The broom rasped softly against the boards. Dust gathered in small gray lines. Jacob sat with his coffee. The sound of sweeping filled the room. A house sound. Not the hollow quiet he knew too well. Clara moved through the kitchen slowly. Careful. Respectful. The broom paused near the door. Her eyes drifted to the window. Out toward the road. Empty. She resumed sweeping. But her gaze returned there again. And again. Jacob saw it. "Someone expecting you?" he asked. The broom slowed. "No." The answer came too fast. She kept sweeping. The bristles scratched harder now. Jacob let the silence settle. The stove cracked softly as another log shifted. Warmth spread deeper through the room. After breakfast, Clara carried the wash basin outside. Cold air brushed the steam rising from the water. The yard smelled of wet earth. The barn door groaned open when she pulled it. Inside, the horse stamped. Hoof against wood. Thud. Clara froze. The gelding tossed its head. Leather reins rattled against the stall. Clara stepped closer. "Slow. Careful. Easy," she whispered. The horse snorted again. Then lowered its head. Her hand touched the animal's neck. Warm hide beneath her palm. Jacob watched from the barn doorway. She moved like someone who understood animals. Quiet. Patient. The horse relaxed. Its breathing slowed. Jacob stepped inside. Straw crunched beneath his boots. "You worked stock before?" Clara nodded. "My father kept 2 mares." Her voice softened at the memory. The gelding nudged her shoulder. She laughed once. The sound startled both of them. Light. Unexpected. Jacob turned toward the stall door. Morning sun pushed through the barn slats now. Golden lines across the hay. Warmth replacing the cold. But outside the barn a distant sound drifted across the valley. Faint. Almost lost in the breeze. Hoofbeats. Clara heard it first. Her hand stilled on the horse's neck. The animal lifted its head. Ears forward. Jacob stepped to the barn entrance. The sound faded quickly. Gone again. Only wind moving across wet grass. Clara's breath stayed shallow. "You expecting riders?" Jacob asked. "No." Again too quick. Jacob watched her. But he said nothing. They worked the rest of the morning. Clara scrubbed the porch boards. Water splashed across the wood. The brush rasped steady. Jacob repaired the fence near the corral. Hammer strikes rang sharp in the air. Clang. Clang. Life moved through the ranch again. The sun climbed higher. Warmth soaked into the ground. But every so often Clara's head turned toward the road. Listening. Waiting. The afternoon quiet deepened. Crows called from the far cottonwoods. The wind rattled dry branches. Jacob finished the fence and leaned on the post. Across the yard Clara hung washed cloth near the porch. The fabric snapped gently in the breeze. For a moment the ranch looked almost peaceful. Like it once had. Then the horse in the barn stamped again. Hard. Thud. Clara froze mid-step. The wind carried something faint across the hills. Leather creaking. A distant jingle of metal. Not close. But not far either. Jacob's eyes moved to the road beyond the gate. Still empty. But the quiet had changed. Clara lowered the cloth slowly. Her voice came barely above the breeze. Jacob. He didn't look away from the road. Yes. If someone comes asking for me. The gate chain shifted softly in the wind. Clink. Clara swallowed. Please don't tell them I'm here. Jacob's jaw tightened. The ranch stood warm behind him. Fire in the stove. Clean floors. Bread on the table. A house beginning to breathe again. He glanced once toward Clara. Fear sat plain in her eyes now. Jacob looked back to the empty road. The chain moved again. Clink. And the quiet of the valley felt thinner than it had that morning. Morning settled over the Hale ranch with a pale band of sunlight across the kitchen table. The stove breathed steady warmth. Tick. 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 Iron expanding. Jacob Hale poured oats into the pot. The wooden spoon scraped slowly along the bottom. Soft circles. Steam lifted toward the rafters. Across the table Clara Whitmore folded dry cloth from yesterday's washing. Each piece stacked neat. Order. Quiet work. The house had begun to learn new sounds. The broom rasping the floor. The kettle lid tapping when the water stirred. Bootsteps crossing boards that once heard nothing but Jacob's way. Clara set the last cloth aside. Smells good, she said. Jacob nodded once. He ladled oats into 2 bowls. The spoon clinked against the metal. Clink. Clara wrapped her hands around the bowl. Warmth spread through her fingers. Outside the wind moved lightly through the cottonwoods. Leaves whispered together. Jacob sat across from her. The chair creaked under him. They ate in slow silence. The kind that no longer felt hollow. Clara glanced toward the window again. The road beyond the fence lay empty. Morning light touched the wet ground. No riders. Still she watched a moment longer. Jacob noticed. You sleep any? He asked. A little. Her spoon moved through the oats. Dreams? Clara hesitated. Just the storm. The answer hung there. Not quite the truth. Jacob let it pass. After breakfast the day unfolded in quiet rhythm. Clara swept the porch again. The broom rasped steady across the boards. Dust gathered along the edges. Jacob hauled fresh wood from the shed. Logs thumped onto the porch. Thud. Thud. The stove welcomed each piece with a hungry crackle. Warmth building. Life settling. Clara paused while sweeping. The breeze carried a faint sound across the valley. Metal shifting. Leather creaking. Her head lifted sharply. The broom stopped moving. Jacob stepped onto the porch with another armful of wood. You hear something? He asked. Clara forced the broom to move again. Just the wind. The word sounded thin. Jacob set the wood down. The porch boards groaned under the weight. He looked down the road. Empty. Only dust and sunlight stretching toward the hills. But Clara kept sweeping faster now. The rasp of bristles filled the quiet. Jacob said nothing. By midday the sun warmed the yard. The barn smelled of hay and old leather. Clara brushed the gelding while Jacob repaired a broken stall hinge. Hammer strikes rang through the barn. Clang. Clang. The horse flicked its tail lazily. Clara worked the brush through the animal's coat. Soft strokes. Dust floating in golden light. You handle stock well, Jacob said. My father taught me. Her voice softened again. He said horses listen better than most men. Jacob almost smiled. Almost. The hinge snapped back into place. Metal settled with a dull click. The barn quieted again. For a moment it felt peaceful. Then Clara's brush struck something hard beneath the saddle blanket hanging nearby. Tap. She lifted the blanket. A worn saddlebag slipped loose and fell onto the straw. Thump. Jacob glanced over. You bring that with you? Clara froze. Her hand hovered over the bag. Yes. She crouched quickly and picked it up. But the flap had already opened. A folded paper slid out. It landed in the straw with a soft whisper. Clara reached for it too fast. Jacob's hand stopped her. "Hold on." His voice stayed calm, but firm. He bent and lifted the paper. The parchment crackled softly. Old. Weathered. Clara stood very still. Jacob unfolded it slowly. The barn filled with a faint rustle of stiff paper. Lines of ink stretched across the page. Property marks. Survey lines. A ranch brand stamped in faded black. Jacob's brow tightened. This is a deed. Clara's breathing grew shallow. Jacob studied the name printed along the edge. The brand burned into the corner felt strangely familiar. But the paper had been torn down one side. Half the document missing. He looked up. "Where'd you get this?" Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the straw. "My father kept it hidden." "Why bring it here?" She swallowed. "Because someone else wants it." The barn fell silent. Only the horse shifting its weight broke the stillness. Hoof against wood. Thud. Jacob folded the paper again. The parchment crackled between his fingers. "Who?" Clara hesitated. Outside the barn a gust of wind rattled the loose gate chain. Clink. Scrape. Clink. The sound carried into the barn like a warning. Clara flinched. "He owns land all through this valley," she whispered. Jacob waited. "He calls it his." The words came slow. But it wasn't always his. Jacob's jaw hardened. "And this paper proves that?" Clara nodded. "Yes." Jacob stared at the torn edge of the deed. Half missing. Half truth. The barn air felt colder suddenly. Outside a crow cried from the fence post. Harsh. Jacob handed the paper back. Clara slipped it quickly into the saddlebag. Her fingers trembled. "You run from him?" Jacob asked. She did not answer. But the silence said enough. Jacob turned toward the barn door. Sunlight spilled across the yard. Warm. Peaceful. Yet the gate chain moved again in the breeze. Clink. Jacob listened to the sound for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. "If a man's chasing that paper..." He looked back at Clara. "He'll ride here sooner or later." Clara held the saddlebag tight against her chest. "I know." The horse shifted again. Leather creaked in the stall. Outside the quiet valley stretched beneath bright afternoon sun. But the warmth felt thinner now. Like a fire burning low beneath the ashes, the afternoon settled heavy over the Hale ranch. Sunlight pressed warm against the porch boards. The stove inside the house had gone quiet for the day. Only wind moved through the cottonwoods. Soft leaves whispering. Jacob Hale leaned against the fence post near the corral. A length of wire stretched between his hands. He twisted it slowly with the pliers. Metal groaned as it tightened. Across the yard Clara Whitmore hung fresh cloth along the line. The fabric snapped lightly in the breeze. White against the blue sky. A peaceful sight. For a moment the ranch looked like a place that had never known trouble. Clara paused and pressed a hand to her back. The sun warmed her shoulders. Jacob watched the road beyond the gate. Dust lay flat and empty. No riders. The wire snapped tight. Twist. Creak. The fence held. Clara lifted another cloth from the basket. She worked carefully. Deliberate. Like someone trying to keep her mind from wandering. But her eyes drifted toward the road again. The habit had grown stronger these past days. Jacob noticed. He always noticed. "You expecting visitors now?" he called. Clara shook her head. The cloth line rope squeaked as it stretched. "No." Jacob wiped his hands on his trousers. The quiet felt too clean. Too easy. Then the horse in the barn snorted sharply. The sound carried across the yard. Clara stiffened. Jacob turned toward the road. At first there was nothing. Then dust lifted far down the trail. A thin gray line. Moving. Jacob's jaw tightened. The gelding in the barn stamped once. Hoof against wood. Thud. Clara's hand dropped the cloth she was holding. The wind carried a distant rhythm. Hooves. Slow. Measured. Not one horse. More. Jacob leaned his forearms against the fence rail. Watching. The riders came slowly over the rise. 3 men. Their coats dark against the bright afternoon. The lead horse carried a tall rider with a straight back and steady pace. The man did not hurry. He rode like someone who expected doors to open before he knocked. Clara stepped back from the clothesline. Her breath shortened. Jacob spoke without looking at her. Inside. She didn't move. Jacob turned his head slightly. Now. Clara gathered the cloth basket with trembling hands. The wicker creaked as she lifted it. Her steps crossed the porch quickly. Boards groaning beneath her feet. The door opened. Closed. The latch dropped. Clack. Jacob remained at the fence. The riders approached the gate. Dust swirled around their horses' legs. Leather creaked with each step. The gate chain rattled as the breeze shifted. Clink. Scrape. The lead rider stopped just outside the fence. His horse snorted once. The man removed his hat slowly. Dark hair slicked neatly beneath it. A trim mustache. Eyes sharp and patient. Well now, the man said. His voice carried easily across the yard. This must be Jacob Hale's place. That depends on who's asking. The man smiled faintly. Wallace Mercer. The name settled like a cold stone. Behind Mercer the other 2 riders stayed silent. Their horses shifted. Bits jingled softly. Jacob walked toward the gate. His boots crushed gravel with steady weight. He stopped a few feet from the fence. Mercer rested both hands on the saddle horn. I'm looking for a woman, Mercer said. Jacob said nothing. Mercer studied the house. The porch. The barn. The clothesline. One of the white sheets still swayed in the wind. Mercer's eyes lingered on it. Then returned to Jacob. Clara Whitmore. The name sounded wrong in Mercer's mouth. Like something owned. Jacob leaned one arm on the fence rail. Never heard of her. Mercer chuckled softly. His horse shifted closer to the gate. Leather creaked. Oh, I believe you have. Jacob did not move. The breeze rattled the gate chain again. Clink. Mercer's gaze flicked toward the house. A window curtain shifted. Just slightly. Mercer saw it. His smile widened. Pretty place you got here, he said. Quiet. Jacob followed Mercer's gaze. The curtain had gone still again. State your business, Jacob said. Mercer tipped his hat back on his head. Miss Whitmore left my property without permission. The words came smooth. Like polished wood. She's under contract. Jacob's eyes hardened. People ain't cattle. Mercer laughed quietly. Depends who signed the paper. Behind him one of the riders shifted in the saddle. The horse snorted. The smell of sweat and leather drifted across the fence. Mercer leaned forward slightly. If she happens to wander through here. He let the sentence hang. You'd be wise to send her along. Jacob said nothing. The quiet stretched. Wind moved through the cottonwoods again. Leaves whispering. Mercer studied Jacob's face carefully. Looking for cracks. Looking for fear. But Jacob Hale had worn silence too long. Mercer sighed lightly. Well. He nudged his horse back from the gate. Dust stirred under the hooves. If you see her. His eyes flicked once more toward the house. Tell her Wallace Mercer is patient. He turned his horse. The other riders followed. Leather creaked. Bits jingled. Hooves thudded against the road. Jacob watched them ride away. The dust trail stretched down the valley again, slowly fading. The gate chain swung once more in the breeze. Clink, clink. Jacob stayed at the fence a long moment, listening to the fading hoofbeats. The valley returned to quiet. But it was a thinner quiet now, the kind that breaks easily. The porch door creaked open behind him. Clara stepped out slowly. Her face had lost its color. "Did he see me?" she whispered. Jacob didn't turn. "Maybe." The wind lifted the sheet on the clothesline. It snapped sharply in the air. Clamp. Clara hugged her arms tight around herself. "Jacob." Her voice trembled. "He won't stop." Jacob finally looked toward the road again. The dust had settled, but something heavier lingered in the air. "I figured that." Morning came cold the next day. Gray clouds pressed low across the valley. The kitchen stove cracked awake as Jacob Hale pushed another log into the fire. Wood snapped. Flame crawled slowly through the bark. Warmth spread across the small room. Clara Whitmore stood at the table kneading dough. Her fingers worked the flour quietly. Press. Fold. Press. The house carried new sounds again. Bread dough thumping softly. The kettle beginning its slow rattle. Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Steam drifted between them. Neither spoke at first. Outside, the wind brushed the porch boards. A loose nail ticked faintly beneath each gust. Tick. Tick. Clara's hand slowed. "You think he'll come back?" she said. Jacob took a sip. He didn't ride out here for conversation. Clara pressed harder into the dough. The table creaked beneath her weight. Silence stretched again. The kettle lid began to chatter lightly. Clink. Clink. Jacob stood and moved it aside. The room settled back into quiet warmth. For a moment the ranch almost felt normal. Bread baking. Coffee steaming. Morning light touching the floorboards. Then the gelding in the barn let out a sharp snort. Loud. Sudden. Clara froze. Her hands stayed buried in the dough. Jacob set his cup down slowly. The porch boards groaned as he stepped outside. Cold air bit at his face. The valley lay still. Then the sound reached him. Hooves. Closer this time. Not 3. More. The dust rose along the road again. Jacob's jaw tightened. Behind him the door creaked open. Clara stepped onto the porch. Her voice barely carried. "Is it him?" Jacob did not answer. 6 riders crested the hill. Mercer rode in front again. But this time another man rode beside him. A deputy. The badge caught the gray light. Clara's breath faltered. Jacob spoke without looking back. "Inside." She hesitated. "Jacob. Inside." The word carried weight. Clara stepped back through the door. The latch fell shut. Clack. Jacob walked down the porch steps. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The riders reached the gate. Mercer tipped his hat again. Same polite smile. Same patient eyes. But the deputy leaned forward in his saddle. He looked tired. Annoyed. "You Jacob Hale?" the deputy asked. "That depends who's asking." The deputy exhaled through his nose. "Name's Deputy Collins." He lifted a folded paper. The parchment snapped once in the wind. "We've got a legal complaint filed by Mr. Mercer here." Mercer sat silent beside him. "Watching. Always watching." Collins continued. "Woman named Clara Whitmore left his employment without settling contract terms." Jacob leaned his arms on the fence rail again. The wood creaked softly. "She's not livestock." Collins shrugged. "Contract says otherwise." Mercer's horse stamped lightly. Hoof against dirt. Clara's curtain shifted in the window again. "Just enough." Mercer noticed. His smile deepened. Jacob saw it. The wind rattled the gate chain. Clink. Scrape. Collins unfolded the paper further. "If Miss Whitmore happens to be here." His voice trailed off. "I'm authorized to escort her back." Jacob's eyes hardened. "Or what?" Collins rubbed his jaw. "Or we file obstruction." Mercer spoke then. His voice smooth as river stones. "Jacob, I admire a man protecting his property." He paused. "But Clara belongs under my roof." Jacob did not move. Behind him the stove inside the house cracked loudly as a log shifted. Warmth. Life. Mercer leaned forward slightly. "Let the law settle it," he said. "Bring her out." The silence thickened. Wind pushed dust along the road. Leaves whispered through the cottonwoods. Clink. The gate chain moved again. Jacob glanced toward the house. Clara stood just inside the doorway now. Her face pale. Eyes steady. Jacob looked back at Mercer. "No." The word landed flat. Collins sighed heavily. "Don't make this harder." Mercer lifted a gloved hand. "Calm. Patient. Deputy." Collins lowered the paper. Mercer turned his horse slowly. Leather creaked. "Well," Mercer said. "I had hoped for cooperation." He glanced toward the barn. The clothesline. The quiet house. Then back to Jacob. "Next time I come." He paused. "I won't bring only words." The riders turned together. Hooves thudded across the dirt. Dust followed them down the road again. But this time the deputy looked back once. Uneasy. The valley fell quiet again after they disappeared. The kind of quiet that feels colder than winter. Jacob stood at the gate long after the dust settled. Behind him the porch boards creaked softly. Clara stepped outside. Her voice trembled. "They'll come back." Jacob nodded. "Yeah." The wind brushed across the empty road again. But far down the valley another faint sound echoed. A hammer striking metal. Clang. From Mercer's direction. Work being done. Preparations. Clara hugged her arms tighter. "What are they building?" Jacob stared toward the distant hills. His voice came low. "Pressure." The gate chain swung once more in the breeze. Clink. And the warmth inside the Hale house suddenly felt very fragile. Night settled heavy over the Hale ranch. Cold crept through the yard as the last light slipped behind the hills. Inside the house the stove burned bright. Flames snapped around the logs. Crack. Crack. Warm light filled the kitchen. Clara Whitmore stirred a pot slowly over the iron lid. The spoon traced quiet circles. Steam rose into the rafters. Jacob Hale sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Cloth moved along the barrel. Metal glinted in the firelight. The house held warmth. But the quiet carried weight tonight. Outside the wind pushed through the cottonwoods. Leaves whispered like distant voices. Clara set two bowls on the table. The spoon tapped the iron pot. Clink. Soup slid into the bowls. The smell filled the room. Hot broth. Fresh bread. Life trying to settle. Jacob set the rifle beside his chair. Clara noticed. "You think he'll come tonight?" she said. Jacob tore a piece of bread. "Men like Mercer don't rush." Clara sat slowly. The chair creaked beneath her. They ate in silence. Spoon against bowl. Soft. The stove cracked as a log shifted. Then the horse in the barn stamped hard. Thud. Clara's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. Jacob listened. The horse stamped again. Leather rattled against wood. Jacob stood. The chair scraped the floor. He moved to the door and stepped onto the porch. Cold air rushed against his coat. The yard lay dark beneath the thin moon. Jacob listened. The valley carried distant sounds easily at night. Wind across grass. A far coyote cry. Then another sound, Hoofbeats. Slow. Not close. But moving somewhere beyond the hills? Jacob stood still until the sound faded again. Behind him the door creaked open. Clara stepped onto the porch. Her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Someone riding?" she asked. "Far off." She nodded. But fear lingered in her eyes. They went back inside. The door shut. Clack. Warmth closed around them again. But Clara's hands trembled slightly now. Jacob noticed. "Sit," he said. She remained standing. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table. "I should tell you everything." Jacob waited. The stove breathed steady heat beside them. Tick. Tick. Clara swallowed. "Mercer doesn't just own ranches." Jacob said nothing. "He buys land from widows." Her voice grew thin. "Or men dying of debt." Jacob leaned one hand on the table. Wood creaked beneath his palm. "Legal?" Clara shook her head slowly. "Sometimes." The word lingered. "But most of the time." She looked toward the saddlebag hanging by the wall. "He makes papers say what he wants." Jacob's eyes followed her gaze. The saddlebag rested where she had left it. Silent. Holding its secret. Clara walked to it slowly. The leather strap creaked as she lifted it. She pulled the folded parchment free. The torn deed. The paper crackled in her shaking hands. "My father worked for a surveyor," she said. "He helped measure half the land in this valley." Jacob stepped closer. The stove's warmth brushed his back. Clara opened the deed. The parchment spread across the table. Survey lines. Old signatures. A brand burned into the corner. Jacob leaned over it. His eyes narrowed. Clara touched the torn edge. "The other half of this paper proves Mercer stole 3 ranches." Jacob studied the lines again. "And yours?" Clara shook her head. "No." Her finger traced another mark. A faded brand pressed into the corner. Jacob felt something shift in his chest. He knew that mark. He had seen it carved into wood once. Into iron. Into a gate long ago. Clara spoke softly. "My father said this paper would ruin Mercer." Jacob lifted the deed slightly. The firelight flickered across the ink. "Then why's it torn?" Clara's breath caught. "Because someone tried to burn the other half." The room fell silent. Only the stove crackled. Jacob looked up slowly. "Mercer?" Clara nodded. "He killed the man carrying the full deed." The words landed heavy. Jacob set the paper down again. "Where's the rest?" Clara shook her head. "Lost." Outside the wind shifted. The gate chain moved faintly in the dark. Clink. Jacob stared at the torn edge of the parchment. Half a truth. Half a weapon. Clara's voice trembled again. "If Mercer gets this piece back." She stopped. Jacob finished the thought. "He owns the story again." Clara nodded. The stove snapped loudly behind them. Crack. Jacob folded the deed slowly. The parchment creaked between his fingers. He placed it back in the saddlebag. "Then we keep it here." Clara looked at him. "You don't know what he'll do." Jacob leaned his weight against the table. The wood groaned softly. "I gotta guess." Outside the horse in the barn shifted again. Hoof against wood. Thud. Wind brushed through the yard. The gate chain rattled once more. Clink. Scrape. Clara looked toward the door. Fear still lived in her eyes. But something else had joined it now. Hope. Jacob walked to the rifle and lifted it again. Metal clicked as he checked the chamber. The sound carried sharp in the quiet room. Clara watched him. "You're not afraid of him?" Jacob looked toward the dark window. The valley beyond. The road Mercer would ride again. His voice came low. "I'm tired of men who think paper makes them kings." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods again. Leaves whispered. And somewhere far down the valley a hammer struck iron once more. Clang. Mercer was still building something. Jacob listened to the fading echo. Then he set the rifle beside the stove. Close. Ready. And the warm kitchen suddenly felt like the last quiet place before a storm. Dawn came hard and cold. Frost silvered the grass across the Hale ranch. The stove burned hot inside the kitchen. Crack. Crack. Jacob Hale stood beside it, loading shells into the rifle. Metal slid into place. Click. Across the room, Clara Whitmore wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The fabric rustled softly. Neither spoke. Outside, the valley carried a strange stillness. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to wait. Jacob set the rifle beside the door. The wood stock touched the wall with a dull tap. Clara watched him. "Do you think it's today?" she asked. Jacob looked toward the window. Pale light spread across the road. "Yeah." The word hung heavy. Clara stepped closer to the stove. Warmth brushed her hands. The kettle began to rattle softly. Clink. Clink. Jacob poured coffee into 2 cups. Steam curled between them. A moment of normal life. The kind storms try to erase. Then the horse in the barn screamed. Loud. Sharp. Clara flinched. The cups rattled against the table. Jacob was already moving. The porch door swung open. Cold air cut through the kitchen. The yard lay bright under the rising sun. Dust moved along the road again. But this time the line was thicker. 8 riders. Mercer rode at the front. Jacob stepped off the porch. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. Behind him the door creaked open. Clara stood in the doorway. Fear plain in her eyes. Jacob spoke without turning. "Stay inside." She hesitated. Then the door shut again. Clack. The riders reached the gate. Hooves stamped against frozen dirt. Mercer removed his gloves slowly. Leather creaked. "Well," he said. "Morning, Jacob." Jacob rested one hand on the fence rail. The wood groaned faintly. "You bring a crowd today." Mercer smiled thinly. "Witnesses." One of the riders pushed the gate chain aside. Clink. Scrape. The iron bar lifted. Jacob stepped forward. The rider paused. Mercer lifted a hand. The rider stopped. Mercer leaned forward in the saddle. "Last chance," he said. "Bring Clara Whitmore out." Jacob said nothing. Wind brushed across the yard. The barn door rattled softly. Mercer's smile faded. "You're protecting stolen property." Jacob's eyes hardened. "People ain't property." Mercer's patience snapped. He swung down from his horse. Boots struck the ground. Thud. He walked toward the gate. Dust stirred around his steps. "You think one rancher stops the law?" Mercer said quietly. Jacob did not move. The silence stretched. Then Jacob turned his head slightly. Toward the house. "Clara," he called. The door creaked open. Clara stepped onto the porch. The torn deed rested in her hands. Mercer's eyes sharpened. Jacob took the paper from her. The parchment crackled in the cold air. He lifted it high enough for the riders to see. "This what you came for?" Mercer's voice went tight. "Hand it over." Jacob ignored him. Instead he spoke louder. "So everyone hears it." The riders shifted in their saddles. Leather creaked. Jacob unfolded the deed. The paper snapped once in the wind. "This paper shows Mercer took land from 3 families." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Lies." Jacob tapped the brand stamped into the corner. Ink dark against faded parchment. "You know this mark." The riders leaned closer. One of them muttered under his breath. Mercer stepped forward. "Enough." His hand moved toward his coat. Jacob's rifle lifted from the fence rail. Smooth. Fast. The barrel pointed straight at Mercer's chest. The valley froze. Wind died. Only the faint rattle of the gate chain moved. Clink. Mercer stopped. His hand hovered. Jacob's voice stayed calm. Back up. Mercer stared at him. Anger burned through his smile now. You'll hang for this. Jacob did not blink. Maybe. The riders shifted uneasily. One horse stomped the dirt. Thud. Mercer slowly raised both hands. Then stepped back. One pace. Another. The tension loosened just slightly. But not gone. Mercer's eyes flicked toward Clara on the porch. Hatred there now. You think that scrap of paper saves you? He said. Jacob's finger rested steady on the trigger. No. The wind lifted the corner of the deed. The parchment snapped. Jacob's voice dropped low. But it tells the truth. Mercer spat into the dust. Then turned sharply. Mount up. The riders hesitated. But one by one they wheeled their horses around. Hooves pounded the frozen ground. Dust lifted again. Mercer swung into the saddle. He looked back once. You just made this war. Jacob lowered the rifle slowly. Should have stayed a man, Wallace. Mercer's horse lunged forward. The riders disappeared down the road. The valley slowly breathed again. Wind returned through the cottonwoods. Leaves whispered. Clara stepped down from the porch. Her hands trembled. Jacob stared at the road. The rifle still heavy in his grip. The gate chain swayed in the breeze. Clink. Clink. And both of them knew the fight had only begun. The riders' dust hung over the road long after they were gone. Wind dragged the gray cloud slowly across the valley. The gate chain swayed in the breeze. Clink. Jacob Hale lowered the rifle and rested it against the fence. His shoulders eased a fraction. But the quiet did not feel safe yet. Behind him Clara Whitmore stood in the yard. The torn deed still trembled in her hands. Cold air moved through the cottonwoods. Leaves whispered like distant voices. Jacob looked back at her. You all right? Clara nodded. Though her fingers still shook. I thought he was going to shoot. Jacob glanced down the road again. He still might. The words settled between them. Heavy. Clara stepped closer. Her boots brushed the frost-tipped grass. The morning sun had climbed higher now. Warm light touched the porch boards. But the cold in the air lingered. Jacob took the deed from her again. The parchment crackled softly. He studied the faded brand in the corner. The mark pressed deep into the paper. A longhorn circle. Broken on one side. Something about it pulled at his memory. Clara watched him. You know that brand, she said. Jacob did not answer right away. The wind rattled the chain again. Clink. Scrape. Jacob turned slowly toward the barn. Come on. They walked across the yard. The barn door groaned as Jacob pulled it open. Wood scraping against wood. Inside the air smelled of hay and leather. The gelding lifted its head from the stall. Snorted once. Hoof tapped the boards. Thud. Jacob stepped to a beam near the stall. An old iron brand hung from a nail there. Dark from years of smoke. He lifted it down. Metal clanged softly against the post. Clara watched. Jacob laid the brand beside the deed on a wooden crate. The shapes matched. Perfect. Clara's breath caught. That's the same mark. Jacob nodded slowly. My father's. The words came quiet. He touched the iron brand. Cold. Heavy. This ranch used to carry that mark. Clara looked from the iron to the paper. Her eyes widened. My father said Mercer stole land from a rancher who died in a fire. Jacob's jaw tightened. That rancher was mine. Silence filled the barn. Even the horse stopped shifting. Clara's voice lowered. "You never told anyone?" Jacob stared at the bread. "Town said the papers proved Mercer bought it fair." The wind pushed through the barn cracks. Cold air brushed their coats. Clara unfolded the deed again. The parchment snapped once in the breeze. Her finger traced the faded ink. "This half shows the real boundary lines." Jacob leaned closer. The survey marks stretched across the page. His eyes followed the lines, then stopped. Right where the Hale ranch stood. "This land," he murmured. Clara nodded. "Your father never sold it." The barn fell silent again. Only the distant cry of a crow broke the air. Jacob straightened slowly. All those quiet years. Working land he believed half lost. Letting Mercer's name sit over the valley like a crown. Clara folded the deed again. "If we had the other half." Jacob finished the thought. "Mercer loses everything." The horse shifted again in the stall. Leather creaked. Outside the wind carried a faint sound from the road. A wagon somewhere far away. Life continuing. Clara looked toward the barn door. Fear crept back into her face. "He won't stop now," she said. Jacob rested the iron brand back against the crate. "No." Her voice trembled. "He'll burn this place to get that paper." Jacob picked up the rifle again. The metal clicked softly as he checked the chamber. Outside the sunlight had grown warmer. But the valley still carried a chill. Jacob walked toward the barn door. Clara followed. They stepped back into the yard. The house stood quiet. Smoke rising gently from the stovepipe. A home. Jacob looked across the fence line. Fields stretching toward the hills. His father's land. Stolen on paper. But not in truth. The gate chain moved again in the breeze. Clink. Clara hugged the saddlebag close to her chest. "What do we do now?" Jacob looked down the road Mercer had taken. His voice came low. "We finish what your father started." The wind carried the words across the yard. Clara nodded slowly. Hope and fear mixed in her eyes. Jacob rested the rifle against his shoulder. The valley looked peaceful again. But now the truth had teeth. And somewhere beyond the hills Wallace Mercer was already planning his next move. Spring came slowly to the Hale ranch. Snow melted from the hills in thin silver streams. Morning sunlight spread warm across the porch boards. The stove inside the kitchen burned low. Soft. Steady. Jacob Hale stepped onto the porch with a tin cup in his hand. Coffee steam curled into the cool air. The yard smelled of wet earth and new grass. Across the fence line a calf bulled from the pasture. Life moving again. Jacob rested one arm on the rail. The wood no longer creaked like an old wound. Behind him the kitchen door opened. Clara Whitmore stepped outside carrying a basket of bread. The cloth covering it lifted gently in the breeze. Warm air followed her onto the porch. Fresh bread. Coffee. A home. Clara set the basket on the table beside Jacob. "Morning," she said. Jacob nodded once. "Morning." The valley looked different now. Fences repaired. Fields turned dark with new planting. Smoke rose from other ranch houses in the distance. Neighbors had begun riding past again. Not to question. To visit. Clara sliced the bread. The knife tapped lightly against the board. Thok. Jacob watched the road beyond the gate. Habit still lingered. But the road stayed quiet. No dust. No riders with cold eyes. Clara noticed where he was looking. He's not coming back. Jacob took a slow drink of coffee. The cup warmed his hands. Jail bars keep a man busy. Clara smiled faintly. The memory still felt strange. The town gathering. The deputy reading the full deed once the missing half appeared. A surveyor's widow had carried the rest all those years. Mercer's papers had fallen apart in daylight. Forgery. Theft. 3 ranches restored. One trial finished. The wind moved through the cottonwoods again. Leaves whispered softly. Clara passed Jacob a slice of bread. Warm. Buttered. He took a bite. Simple food. Peaceful. Yet a small tension still lived in the valley. Rumors traveled fast in ranch country. Men who once worked for Mercer still rode somewhere beyond the hills. Clara leaned against the porch rail. "Do you think they'll try anything?" Jacob looked toward the far ridge. Snow still clung there in narrow lines. Men like that follow money. His eyes returned to the fields. "Money's gone now." Clara nodded slowly. The quiet felt stronger today. Not empty. Full. The barn door opened behind them with a soft groan. A boy's laugh drifted out. High. Bright. Clara turned toward the sound. Little Thomas Hale ran across the yard with the ranch dog chasing his boots. Dust puffed beneath his feet. The dog barked happily. Jacob watched them. The boy reached the gate and grabbed the chain. Clink. The sound rang clear in the warm air. Thomas swung it once. Clink. Clink. Clara laughed softly. "Careful with that." The boy grinned. "I like the sound." Jacob stepped down from the porch. His boots pressed firm into the spring grass. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That chain means the gate's closed." Thomas nodded. "But it still sings." The boy gave it one more gentle shake. Clink. The sound carried across the yard. Not lonely now. Not desperate like that storm night months ago. Just a small bright sound in a living place. Clara joined them at the gate. Sunlight touched her hair. The valley stretched green and open around them. Jacob rested both hands on the fence rail. His father's brand hung on the barn wall again. Back where it belonged. Clara slipped her hand into his. Warm. Steady. "Feels different now," she said. Jacob watched the boy chasing the dog through the grass. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. The gate chain swayed once more. Clink. Jacob nodded. "Yeah." The ranch breathed around them. Warm. Alive. And the sound that once called for help now welcomed every new morning. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.